Dear class of education and sustainability, as part of the creation of a truly sustainable society, one of the key issues we need to confront is militarism, especially in a country like the US, which is the most powerful country militarily speaking in the world. So, what is militarism? Militarism is the exaggerated presence of military values and interests in the society at large. And it's based on the idea that the country is constantly under siege and that wars are inevitable. Militarism is based on the idea that the military is an exceptional social class in society and ought to be revered and glorified. After all, in this view, they are the first line of defense against the quote enemy. And the enemy is anyone or any state that is deemed as highly dangerous to the national interests of the country. In this presentation, I want to unpack what this means to the country and to the educational system in particular. In this photo, I want to introduce to you my two kids, Emilio and Matias, and their young friend Zoe, who are doing something that we don't do often enough, which is calling for peace while riding our bicycles. This presentation is divided into two halves. The first half explains how militarism has permeated many sectors of US society, and the second half deals with the educational system. A good place to start talking about this topic are two amazing speeches that President Dwight Eisenhower gave, one in 1953 and the other in 1961. The one in 1953 was called the Chance for Peace speech, and it was made about a month after the death of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, and a few months into his first presidency. Given that he was a former military man, his words carried a lot of weight, and it read in part, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hope of its children." The bookend to this Chance for Peace speech was his 1961 farewell address before John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency. In that farewell speech, he warned against the military-industrial complex, or more precisely, the military-industrial congressional complex, which is basically an informal alliance between the Pentagon, the defense industry, Congress, and the executive branch. Part of the speech read, "By the 1950s, the United States created a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions, and the perils of this new conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry were dire. There is great danger in the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex, and only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshings of the huge industrial and military machinery with our peaceful methods and goals." Historians have debated the sincerity of his speeches, because while they were amazing in their beauty, force, and foresight, his words were often not backed up by his actions. During the 1950s, the Cold War deepened under his administration, with a huge increase in weapons buildup. He was the first US president to visit the fascist regime of Francisco Franco in Spain, and the CIA was involved in all kinds of covert actions against democratic regimes around the world, including the deposing of the first democratically elected president in Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, and deposing the first socialist, democratically elected president in the Americas, Gustavo Arbenz. But nonetheless, his warning became true in what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, with defense contractors, the Pentagon, and congressional leaders creating an unholy alliance, turned into what some called the Pentagonization of American life. According to Nick Turse, who wrote the book The Complex: How the Military Invades Our Everyday Lives, published in 2008, there are about 100,000 civilian companies, 100,000 civilian companies in the Pentagon's payroll or connected to the defense industry, Pretty much every sector of American life. Everything from ExxonMobil to Apple Computers, Starbucks, McDonald's, Walmart, Costco, Hollywood movies that deal with war, many universities whose research grants are tied to the defense industry, school districts that receive military equipment that is then being used by the school police. This latter point comes from a program called 1033, which was established in 1997 with the purpose of transferring excess military equipment to civilian law enforcement agencies. As of 2014, that is last year, 8,000 local police forces had received military weaponry for more than $5 billion, dollars, and it's all free of charge. So basically, one finds in a typical city in the US police officers with marine issue camouflage and military grade body armors, toting assault rifles and even grenade launchers, and rolling around in armored vehicles, making police and sometimes school police indistinguishable from actual soldiers. And this at a time when crime has actually gone down in the US, not up. So this equipment may be fine for an actual war, but not for streets in US cities. A good question is, where does all this excess military equipment come from? In part, it comes from the exorbitant amounts of money that the US spends on defense. According to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, in 2014, the US spent more on defense than the next 8 countries combined. Defense spending accounted in 2014 for about 20% of all federal spending, nearly as much as Social Security or the combined spending for Medicare and Medicaid. On the positive side, worldwide military expenditures went down almost 2% from 2013. This decrease, however, was due to Western countries, including the US, which spent less on the military. The reasons it went down for the US were mainly due to the end of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and budget cuts made by the US Congress in 2011, and for Europe it had more to do with austerity policies due to the economic crisis. On the negative side, outside of Europe and the US, many other countries have actually increased their military spending. For instance, the next 3 countries after the US in terms of military spending, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, actually double the amount they generally spend. Incidentally, in most of Latin America, military spending also went up, especially in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela. And who do you think are the main weapons providers to Latin America? Russia, China, and the US. I said before that the US is the country that spends the most in military expenditures worldwide, more than the next 8 countries combined. But percentage-wise of its GDP, it's less than 4%. But that still accounts for about 20% of all federal expenditures. And even that percentage does not include some other defense-related non-DoD spending, DoD being Department of Defense. Things like Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, and interest paid on debt incurred in past wars. For the longest period of time, the US was the largest exporter of weapons worldwide, but in 2013, it was dethroned by Russia. Of the top 10 military contractors, 7 are US based, including Lockheed Martin, which is the biggest one, and other companies include Boeing and Raytheon. Another aspect of the militarization of the US is that the Pentagon is the largest landowner in the world. It owns 900 bases in the US alone, along with at least 460 bases overseas in 38 countries worldwide. That's for 2009. This does not include bases that are not under the control of the US, but are still used by US forces in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Colombia. A key question is, why does the US need at least 460 bases worldwide? 460 bases? And I say at least 460 bases because the crazy thing is that no one really knows how many bases the US really has abroad. It's one of the best kept secrets of the US. Here's what Nick Turse, author of The Complex, found after perusing all of the documents available on the topic. And he's an expert in this matter. And he told the Asia Times in 2011 the US has 460 bases overseas. It has 507 permanent bases overseas. What is the US doing with more than 460 foreign bases? Why does it have 662 bases abroad? Does the US really have more than 1,000 military bases across the globe? There are more than 1,000 US military bases dotting the globe. To be specific, the most accurate count is 1,077, unless it's 1,088, or if you count differently, 1,169, or even 1,180. Actually, the number might even be higher. Nobody knows for sure. And that's the situation with the Pentagon being the largest landowner in the world. When one compares the militarism of, say, the US and Russia, these are quite different. In Russia, during certain holidays, the military loves to display their tanks, airplanes, helicopters, even missiles, as a way of amplifying their jingoistic nationalism. In the US, that jingoism is more insidious, and one of the ways it's done through Hollywood, a relationship that dates back about a century ago when the US Army lent 1,000 cavalry troops and a military band to the incredibly successful film called Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. For those of you who are movie buffs, this was a film that portrayed the relationship of two families during and after the US Civil War, and that presented the KKK as a heroic force. Yes, you heard that right. The KKK was presented as a heroic force. The cozy relationship between Hollywood and the military continued unabated throughout the 20th century, with such Hollywood luminaries as Humphrey Bogart, Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, and John Wayne, all of whom participated in films that portrayed the military in a positive light, and the movies in turn received aid from the military. The Department of Defense operates something called the Entertainment Media Division, and the DoD has liaison offices in LA with all of the military branches. When the movie Top Gun was released in the mid 1980s, it became one of the top grossing movies in history, and the Navy actually set up recruitment exhibits outside of the theaters. For many movie directors and producers, this relationship is completely non controversial. As Ian Bryce, the producer of the film Transformers, said once you get Pentagon approval, you have created a win-win situation. We want to cooperate with the Pentagon to show them off in the most positive light. And the Pentagon, likewise, wants to give us the resources to be able to do that. Before I start to explore the influence of the military on education, I want to end by going back to Dwight Eisenhower's wise words of the 1950s and how his speeches were often not backed up by his actions. In a similar way as President Bill Clinton's wise words after the Columbine massacre of 1999, when he said, "We must teach our children to resolve their conflicts with words, not with weapons." But these words were said in the wake of the US dropping more bombs on the former Yugoslavia than were dropped in the whole of World War II. Perhaps the most obvious way in which the industrial military complex influences education is by offering research funds to universities. The DoD is the third largest provider of federal grants to colleges and universities, and weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon are also key players in funding university research. So much so that for many universities, this funding from either the DoD or defense contractors greatly determines research priorities in areas such as engineering and science. In fact, it was then Senator William Fulbright, the same person who originated the Fulbright Fellowships and a key critic of the Vietnam invasion, who expanded Eisenhower's idea of the military complex to include academia. and Fulbright warned that in lending itself too much for the purpose of government, a university fails its higher purpose. I want to highlight one of the key players in terms of its relationship with the military, and that is MIT, whose links to the Department of Defense go back to World War II. Year after year, the millions kept pouring in, and so MIT decided to create in the 1970s the MIT Lincoln Lab, based in Lexington, Massachusetts, where up until today, most of the university's defense related research is conducted. In addition, there have been even offshoots, such as the Mitri Corporation, founded in the 1950s by former employees and students of MIT, and every year it receives hundreds of millions for military research. And this is a non-profit company. So the ties with the universities are deep and long-lasting, and other countries have started to copy this model, such as Great Britain and Japan. It's no secret that in times of economic crisis, the military becomes a key social safety net for poor families. One doesn't have to be too cynical to realize that this is partly done on purpose. The tougher the times, the more likely it is that one will join the military. In 2015, we're seeing that at the same time that the Republican led Congress wants to increase defense spending, they want to make deep cuts in social services, including healthcare for the poor. And to make the military more enticing, the deal comes with several nice, sweet packages. One of them is access to higher education for free or almost free. While the US offers no public universal higher education program in civil society, the military virtually does. Some of the financial programs include the Armed Forces Tuition Assistance, which provides several $1,000s a year for tuition and fees, the post 9/11 GI Bill, which is an updated version of the World War II era legislation, and depending on the length of service, the bill pays 40% to 100% of tuition and fees at public colleges and universities, and even at some private universities. The Montgomery GI Bill, in which a full-time student could receive up to $1,500 a month for education. And then there are the ROTC scholarship programs, which can result in a full 4-year scholarship. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for more people going into higher education. And I'm glad that current and former military personnel can have access to higher education for free or almost free. But then let's do it for everyone, military and civilians alike. Otherwise, it's discriminatory against non-military folk. The penetration into education goes further down, into public high schools and even middle schools. In high schools, there's something called junior ROTCs, and part of their mission is to instill citizenship and patriotism and respect for the US military. But these are not cheap programs. In some cases, to maintain them, they cost up to $50,000 a year. The deal is that the DoD pays for books, uniforms, and special equipment, but the rest, which includes building facilities and maintenance, and the salaries of instructors, is paid by the school district. And to top it off, the militaristic practices have even gone down to middle schools. These are called Middle Schools Cadet Corps. In 2005, Chicago had 26 middle school cadet corps enlisting close to 800 kids. This has been met by a lot of opposition from liberal groups that charge that this practice violates the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child by targeting young children for military recruitment. And of course, a key issue is that school districts could certainly use the limited funds they have to support the intended goals of JROTC, which are to foster leadership, discipline, community service, and being physically fit without the military accoutrements. Now, a good question is, why should civilian schools pay for highly propagandistic curriculum that teaches love for the military? That is not the purpose of schools. Schools already instill citizenship and patriotism, but respect and acceptance of the military should not be the purpose of civilian schools. One last manifestation of militarism in education that I will cover is found in history and social studies textbooks. Here, wars in which the US was the main invader, such as in the case of Iraq, the US is invariably presented in a positive light. In the various textbooks that presented the Iraq invasion, several elements are common. Generally, the Iraq War was presented as two countries of equal force confronting each other, which was clearly false. Number two, the US was presented as if it had no other choice but to invade Iraq, which again was false, because there were other options that the US government decided not to pursue. And the third common element is that the consequences to the country being invaded, in this case Iraq, were barely mentioned. In the case of the Iraq War, the immense devastation that the US caused to Iraq, both in terms of human lives lost and the destruction to its infrastructure, was minimized or not mentioned at all. In terms of how the Iraq War is presented in textbooks, here's a typical example of a US history textbook. It's from 2005, but later textbooks cover this war in a very similar way. First, notice the title, Iraq, Confronting a Dictatorship, followed by a quote by then President Bush that reads, "By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose grave and growing danger." It should be said that by 2004, that is 1 year before this textbook was published, it was already clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction to be found. And yet, the editors of the textbook decided to highlight a quote that was clearly wrong. Then notice the photo that is used. It was the only photo on Iraq used in this textbook. The caption reads, "Iraqis pull down a statue of Saddam Hussein after the dictator's regime is thrown." This event of toppling down Saddam Hussein's statue was actually staged by the US military as a way of showing that US soldiers were welcomed as liberators. But it was all a farce. But the problem is that there was no mention of this farce in the book itself, and thus the fraud is perpetuated in history textbooks that high school students across the US read. There are many other aspects of US militarism and US society and education that I didn't cover, but I hope that this presentation gave you a glimpse of how insidious this intrusion is, and how dangerous it is for the long-term sustainability prospects for the United States and for the world as a whole. I will finish with the words of Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the US, when he wrote, "The spirit of this country is totally adverse to a large military force. I abhor war and view it as the greatest scourge of mankind. Peace and friendship with all mankind is our wisest policy, and I wish we may be permitted to pursue it." Well, that's it for today, dear class. Until our next presentation, bye-bye.